Have you ever felt like you're trying to navigate this uh, sprawling, complex chessboard? Where every player has their own agenda, and the rules just seem to shift with the wind.
Yeah, it can feel exactly like that sometimes.
Maybe you're prepping for a big meeting or, just trying to make sense of the international headlines. But there's this underlying puzzle. How do independent states, often seen as purely self-interested actors, actually manage to cooperate on a global scale?
And maybe the flip side too, right? Why do they sometimes fail spectacularly at cooperation?
Exactly. What are the subtle forces, the hidden drivers, and maybe the unspoken rules that are really shaping our interconnected world?
It's definitely more than just a puzzle, isn't it? It's sort of the very foundation of understanding global events. We constantly see this interplay, this tension between, profound cooperation and baffling conflict.
And what truly matters is the lens we use to view it.
I think so, yeah. Which framework are we applying?
Absolutely. And that's precisely our mission today. Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving deep into some truly fascinating insights from several leading experts in international relations.
We're going to explore some big ideas about power, yeah.
Big ideas about power, the surprising evolution of how states actually behave, and even get into the nitty-gritty of why countries have, well, largely stopped declaring war.
Which is a really interesting phenomenon in itself.
Totally. Our goal here is to equip you with a clear understanding of how nations genuinely interact, moving beyond those simplistic, often kind of misleading narratives, to discover the nuanced forces that are actually at play.
And we'll be drawing from some pretty foundational texts, scholars like Keohane and Nye, Zacher, Doyle, Tannenwald, and Faisal.
Yeah, big names in the field.
And this isn't just about abstract theories you might read in a textbook. It's about understanding the very real, practical implications these ideas have for international cooperation, for conflict, and, for the entire structure of our global system.
You got it. So whether you're trying to decipher global headlines, or maybe preparing for that critical work project that touches on international dynamics, or maybe you're just intensely curious about how the world really ticks.
Uh-huh.
This deep dive is designed to offer you those aha moments. Think of it as your shortcut to being genuinely well-informed, without feeling completely overwhelmed by, well, all the noise out there.
Sounds good. Where do we start?
Let's start digging in.
Ah.
Okay, so to kick us off, let's think about the language we use, how we frame our global interactions. During the Cold War, the rallying cry, especially for American foreign policy, was unequivocally national security.
Oh, absolutely. That phrase carried immense weight.
It was powerful, right? It justified everything from massive alliances and foreign aid to military interventions. Presidents even used it to shape domestic economic policies, like the Marshall Plan.
It was a symbol of power, definitely. And it wasn't just about projecting leadership abroad. Domestically, it could manage expectations, and let's be honest, it could even be manipulated by special interests.
Like oil producers lobbying for import quotas.
Exactly, that kind of thing, yeah. All under the banner of national security. It was incredibly effective at galvanizing both public and political will.
Okay, so now fast forward to today, and we hear a very different word used with similar, maybe, weight. Interdependence.
Right, that's the new buzzword almost.
Political leaders across the globe now frequently portray interdependence as this natural, inevitable force that inherently reduces conflict and, demands cooperation.
You hear phrases like, we're all engaged in a common enterprise.
Exactly. It suggests that those old-school conflicts of interest are somehow passé, outdated.
Yes.
It's often used, much like national security once was, to legitimize leadership and push specific policy agendas.
And this is where it gets, I think, truly fascinating. These two powerful rhetorics, national security and interdependence, they often coexist, but they do so very uneasily.
Uneasily. How so?
Well, national security, taken to its extreme, implies a world of fundamental, potentially violent conflicts between states. It's about threats, rivals, defense. Interdependence, on the other hand, suggests that such conflicts are outdated, or maybe even impossible given our shared fate, our interconnectedness.
Ah, I see the clash. One sees threats, the other sees shared problems.
Precisely. And this creates genuine confusion, not just for policymakers trying to figure out which model to apply to world politics, but, for all of us trying to understand the actual dynamics shaping our lives. It's this constant tension between seeing the world as fundamentally adversarial or fundamentally cooperative.
That's a brilliant observation about that uneasy coexistence. Really makes you pause, doesn't it? When you hear leaders speak passionately about global interconnectedness or shared destiny, are they primarily describing an inherent reality of how the world
Yeah, right. What's
operates?
the alternative?
Or are they also perhaps strategically using a political tool,
Yeah.
a specific kind of rhetoric to influence policy and public opinion, much like national security was used in a previous era? It feels like a crucial distinction to consider when you're analyzing the news.
It definitely is. The language matters enormously.
Okay, moving beyond rhetoric, let's deconstruct something even more fundamental. The very concept of power in this increasingly interdependent world. We often immediately think of power as military might, right?
Big armies, nuclear weapons, that sort of thing.
But it's far more nuanced than that, isn't it?
Yeah.
How would you define power in a way that captures its true breadth?
That's a great starting point because military strength is certainly a dimension, but it's definitely not the whole story. Fundamentally, power. Well, one definition is the ability of an actor to get others to do something they otherwise would not do,
Okay, getting someone to change their behavior.
and at an acceptable cost to the actor. It's ultimately about controlling outcomes. It's not just about having resources like money or weapons, but about effectively using them to steer events in a direction you want.
Right, so it's not just having the biggest stick, but knowing how to use it and, crucially, what it costs you to use it. But if it's about controlling outcomes, how do we even begin to measure that? It sounds incredibly difficult to quantify.
It is incredibly complex. You can look at initial power resources, the potential ability an actor has.
Like their economy size, technology.
Exactly. Economic size, technological advancement, military capabilities, population, territory. But then there's influence over outcomes, which is the actual effect that actor has on specific events.
And they're not always the same thing.
Rarely. There's rarely a one-to-one relationship between the two. Political bargaining is usually the way you try to translate that potential into actual effects. And, a lot can be lost in that translation. A country might have huge resources but be terrible at bargaining or vice versa.
Okay, that makes sense. And this is where it gets really interesting. You mentioned asymmetrical interdependence can actually be a significant, subtle source of power. Can you unpack what that means?
Absolutely. Think about it this way. If one actor in a relationship is significantly less dependent on the other than vice versa.
So I need you less than you need me.
Right. That less dependent actor suddenly has a powerful political resource. Any changes initiated or threatened by this less dependent actor will be less costly to them than to their partners. This provides clear leverage in political bargaining. It's like, if you need the deal more than I do, I have the upper hand.
So if I'm less reliant on you than you are on me for something crucial, like energy or trade, I can exert more influence. That makes intuitive sense. And you've also distinguished between sensitivity dependence and vulnerability dependence. Could you elaborate on why understanding both is so critical?
Yes, this distinction is really vital for getting the nuances. Sensitivity dependence refers to the immediate liability to suffer costly effects before any policies are altered.
So the quick hit.
Yeah, the direct, quick impact. For example, if your country relies heavily on another for oil and that supplier suddenly cuts exports, the immediate economic shock, gas prices skyrocketing, factories slowing, that sensitivity dependence. It's the cost incurred before you can really react effectively.
Right, like when a sudden global event messes up supply chains and you feel the effects in higher prices or empty shelves almost immediately, even if your government is scrambling to find alternatives.
Precisely. Vulnerability dependence, however, is deeper. It's the liability to suffer costs even after policies have been altered over time.
Ah, okay. So it's about the long run.
It measures the costliness of making effective long-term adjustments to a changed environment. So if your country could, over several years, develop alternative energy sources or establish entirely new trading relationships, that would reduce its vulnerability.
But if those long-term adjustments are incredibly difficult or super costly or simply not feasible.
Then your vulnerability remains high, regardless of any immediate policy tweaks you make. This distinction helps us understand the true depth of a country's reliance on others. It goes beyond just the immediate shock to the core capacity for self-reliance or adjustment.
That's a really profound distinction.
Yeah.
You can be sensitive to a shock, but maybe not truly vulnerable if you have alternatives waiting or can develop them. But if you lack those alternatives, that's where the deeper challenge lies.
Exactly.
It makes me think that a leader who only focuses on immediate sensitivity and ignores underlying vulnerability might be making a huge strategic mistake.
Right.
Right. They're missing the long-term foundational risks.
That's a very good way to put it. They might be patching holes while the chef's structurally unsound.
Okay, now, to truly understand how nations interact,
Yeah.
how they cooperate in conflict, we need some fundamental theoretical lenses. Let's start with realism. It's arguably the oldest and most, well, enduring perspective. What's its core claim about international relations?
At its core, realism views international affairs as basically a struggle for power among self-interested states.
Power struggle. Got it.
It posits an anarchic international system, meaning there's no overarching authoritative world government to enforce rules or keep the peace.
Like a global 911 you can call.
Pretty much, yeah, there isn't one. And this anarchy, realists argue, inevitably leads to conflict and war, forcing states to constantly rely on their own means, what they call self-help, for survival. It's a rather bleak but, often empirically compelling picture of global politics.
It certainly feels like it explains a lot of the headlines, doesn't it? The focus on military buildups, rivalries.
It does capture a very significant part of the picture, especially historically.
But what are some of the areas where realism, despite its strengths, might fall short? What are its blind spots?
Well, it struggles, for instance, to fully explain the war on terror,
Mhm.
particularly against non-state actors like al-Qaeda. How do you apply a theory focused entirely on states to a threat that isn't a state?
Right, the model doesn't quite fit.
And it also has a hard time accounting for the apparent failure of balancing behavior against a sole superpower like the United States was, especially after the Cold War. If realism predicts that weaker states should gang up militarily to counter U.S. dominance, why haven't we really seen that happen consistently?
Yeah, that's a good question. Why didn't everyone just ally against the U.S.?
Realism has some answers, but it's a persistent puzzle for the theory. These are significant gaps.
Those are crucial questions. And that brings us to liberalism, which offers a very different and perhaps more optimistic view. How does liberal theory propose to address the anarchy that realists emphasize?
Well, liberal theory fundamentally holds that governments founded on liberty democracies will exercise restraint in their foreign policy, at least towards other democracies.
Okay, so democracy is key.
Yes, it emphasizes that the spread of democracy, robust global economic ties, trade, investment, and the development of international organizations all work together to strengthen peace. For liberals, these are the mechanisms that can temper or even maybe transcend the realist notion of anarchy.
And this is fascinating because if we connect this to the bigger picture, liberal states have indeed created what's been called a separate peace among themselves for over 150 years now.
That's the democratic peace theory, yeah, a very powerful empirical finding.
It aligns with what thinkers like Immanuel Kant argued way back when. The Republican states would foster perpetual peace among themselves, despite any fluctuations in the balance of power or who the current big player, the hegemon, might be. It's a powerful idea.
It is, but, and this is important, it's not without its complexities, because liberalism also has a darker, more assertive side.
How so?
While liberal states might enjoy peace among themselves, they haven't been immune to insecurity, and historically they've found liberal reasons for aggression against non-liberal states.
Ah, so peace for us, but maybe not for them.
Sometimes, yes, they can be quite assertive, even imperialistic when dealing with those outside their democratic club. This tension within liberal thought is crucial to understand. It's not all harmony.
So it's not simply a theory of universal peace, it's a more nuanced story. Can you briefly tell us about some of those internal tensions or different streams of liberal thought? Because it seems like there are multiple ways to be a liberal.
Exactly. For example, you have a figure like Joseph Schumpeter, who argued for what's called liberal pacifism. He believed modern capitalism and democracy naturally lead to peace.
Because war is bad for business.
Pretty much. He saw imperialism as an atavism, a leftover, a relic of older warlike instincts and export monopolists that are fundamentally incompatible with free trade and democracy. For him, a truly liberal society would be a peaceful one, focused on production and exchange.
Okay, that's one view. But then you have someone like Machiavelli, whose perspective, sometimes called liberal imperialism, suggests something quite different.
Indeed. Machiavelli, perhaps surprisingly to some, believed that republics are actually best suited for imperial expansion.
Really? Why?
He argued that liberty fosters strength, citizen participation, and encourages citizens to fight for the glory of the republic, making republics inherently expansive and often aggressive in their pursuit of national interest. It's a stark contrast to Schumpeter's pacifist vision.
Wow, okay. Complete opposite ends of the spectrum there.
Within the liberal tradition, yes.
And then, of course, Kant with his liberal internationalism. Where does he fit into this spectrum?
Kant is sort of the foundational figure for the democratic peace idea. He believed perpetual peace is both an ethical duty and an eventual outcome, but crucially, it's driven by republican constitutions, a commercial spirit, and cosmopolitan law among liberal states.
So again, peace within the club.
Primarily, yes. It's a peace for those inside the liberal zone. He acknowledged the challenges and potential for conflict when liberal states confront non-liberal ones. So even within liberalism, there's this dynamic tension between peace, expansion, and the conditions under which universal peace might truly be possible.
That's incredibly insightful, showing the internal debates within these major theories. Finally, let's turn to constructivism. This offers a truly different perspective, doesn't it? If realism focuses on power and liberalism on institutions and democracy, what does constructivism bring to the table?
Constructivists argue that debates about ideas, norms, and shared understandings are like the very building blocks of international life.
So ideas are central.
Absolutely central. They fundamentally believe that national interest isn't some fixed objective thing out there waiting to be discovered. Instead, it's socially constructed through interaction, through discourse, through shared beliefs.
So how states think about themselves and the world actually shapes their actions.
Precisely. And individuals and groups gain power not just through material resources, but by convincing others to adopt their ideas and ways of seeing the world.
So ideas aren't just secondary to power. They are power in a way. This means that international change often results from the work of intellectual entrepreneurs, right? People promoting new ideas.
Exactly. Think about human rights activists who name and shame regimes into changing their practices.
Or anti-landmine campaigns.
Perfect example. They proselytize new norms about what's acceptable behavior. These groups literally work to change what actors perceive as their interests. They shift the very lens through which states see themselves and their place in the world.
And that's the key, isn't it? Constructivism isn't necessarily replacing realism or liberalism entirely.
No, not necessarily.
But it's trying to explain the origins of the very forces that drive those other theories. It shows how ideas and shared understandings shape what actors perceive as their interests, laying the groundwork for the power struggles or cooperative arrangements that the other theories describe.
That's a great way to put it. It offers a deeper understanding of how the international system itself is structured, not just by material forces like armies and economies, but by collective beliefs and norms. It's a fascinating way to connect the dots, I think.
All right, let's pivot from these big theories to a truly fascinating shift we've seen in global dynamics: the evolving role of military force. It might seem like military power is a state's ultimate tool. It's ace in the hole, right?
That's the traditional view, definitely.
But its actual utility seems to have been dramatically altered in certain contexts. Even when direct military force is technically barred among a group of countries, say, between the superpowers during the Cold War, military power still functions politically. Correct. It still matters.
Absolutely. Even in a stalemate where direct attack is unthinkable, military power remains a potent political tool, primarily through deterrence, but also through linkage.
Linkage.
Yeah, like during the Cold War, for instance, the U.S. explicitly linked its troop levels in Europe to trade and monetary negotiations with its allies. The implicit threat of reducing military protection, or just the sheer presence of such formidable power, provided significant political leverage in those non-military negotiations. So it's not just about direct application, but the shadow it casts.
That's a crucial point, the political leverage of military power, even when it's not being actively used. But it seems like the direct utility of force, actually using it, has undeniably declined in many situations. What are some of the key factors driving this change?
There are several powerful dynamics at play here. First, and most obviously, nuclear weapons fundamentally change the equation.
Mutually assured destruction.
Exactly. An attack against a nuclear power becomes potentially suicidal, rendering these weapons primarily tools of deterrence, not conquest or coercion in the traditional sense. No one wins a nuclear war, so they lose their direct utility for achieving most political aims.
Right, the stakes are just far too high. What else?
Second, conventional force has proven to be, well, less effective against socially mobilized populations.
You mean like guerrilla warfare, popular resistance?
Precisely. As the U.S. painfully learned in Vietnam, or as we saw with the broader decline of colonialism across the globe, you can't simply bomb an ideology or a popular national movement into submission. It often backfires and galvanizes resistance. It's a different kind of fight.
Makes sense. What's the third factor?
Third, there's the economic cost, especially in an interdependent world. Using force on one issue, say, a border dispute can easily rupture mutually profitable relations on other issues, impacting non-security goals like trade, investment, or technological cooperation. It's a costly choice with ripple effects across the board.
So you might win the battle, but lose the economic war, so to speak.
You could put it that way, yeah. And finally, particularly in Western democracies, public opposition to prolonged, costly military conflicts is very high. Leaders are highly accountable to electorates who are increasingly unwilling to stomach long, bloody, expensive wars with unclear benefits.
That last point is really key, isn't it? The domestic political cost. So if the direct use of military force is becoming less effective for achieving certain objectives, especially among powerful nations who are also highly interdependent, how do you think this changes the fundamental calculus for their foreign policy?
Well, it absolutely forces them to look for other ways to exert influence.
Does it push them towards different tools?
It absolutely does. It pushes powerful nations to invest more in what's often called soft power. Things like cultural influence, economic leverage, diplomacy, building alliances, shaping international institutions. It forces a strategic shift away from purely coercive tactics towards more indirect, collaborative, or persuasive approaches.
Because the old ways are too costly or just don't work as well?
Exactly. They recognize that direct military intervention often yields diminishing returns or simply unacceptable costs in today's interconnected world. The challenge then becomes how to achieve national interests without resorting to the very tools that have become too expensive, too risky, or ineffective.
That's a profound shift, suggesting a whole new playbook is emerging. And speaking of profound shifts, let's explore one of the most remarkable developments in international relations: the rise of the territorial integrity norm. If you cast your mind back to the medieval world, it was all overlapping authority, constantly shifting territorial spaces, right?
Yeah, borders were much more fluid, much less clearly defined.
Precise. Surveyed national borders only really came into clear view in the 18th century, emerging as a kind of basic rule of coexistence. But what happened after World War II, specifically, is truly dramatic.
Here's where it gets really interesting, eh? A significant, almost revolutionary development has been the growing respect for the prescription. The rule that force should not be used to alter interstate boundaries. This is what we call the territorial integrity norm, and it represents a massive departure from centuries, millennia really, of international practice.
Where conquest was just part of the game.
It was a primary way states grew and competed. And this isn't just an abstract idea. The data shows a profound shift in how states actually behave regarding borders.
And the numbers are incredibly stark, aren't they? Between, 1651 and 1950, a staggering 67 to 89% of interstate wars resulted in some form of territorial redistribution, borders literally changing hands.
Huge percentage. Conquest was common.
But then, from 1951 to 2000, that figure plummeted to just 27%. That's a massive drop. It indicates a fundamental shift in how states approach the sanctity of borders. What drove this dramatic change? Was it purely practical, like fear, or something deeper?
It seems to be both, actually. There are both instrumental, sort of self-interested reasons and ideational, belief-based roots.
Okay, what are the instrumental reasons?
On the instrumental side, states, especially industrialized ones, developed a deep-seated fear that territorial revisionism trying to change borders by force could easily ignite major, incredibly destructive wars.
Like World War I and World War II.
Exactly. The horrors of those two world wars, combined with the existential threat of nuclear weapons later on, drove home the point that aggressive border changes were just too dangerous, potentially catastrophic. Plus, there's the clear negative impact that conflict has on complex commercial relations. It's simply bad for business in an interconnected economy.
So a pragmatic calculation that the cost of grabbing territory most of the time simply isn't worth the risk anymore.
That's a big part of it, but it's not just cold, hard self-interest. There's also a powerful ideational component.
Meaning beliefs changed.
Yes. The growth of liberal democratic values, particularly in Western states but spreading beyond, fostered a belief that imposing rule on another juridical state, another recognized country, is inherently wrong.
Tied to self-determination.
It's linked to the right of self-determination, yes. Though crucially, this norm prioritizes the order and stability of existing juridical states over the self-determination of ethnic groups within those states.
Ah, that's an important distinction. So it protects existing countries, not necessarily every group wanting its own country.
Right. It prioritizes global order over potentially endless fragmentation and internal conflicts based on ethnicity.
So it's a norm that basically says, okay, we've got these lines on a map, and even if they're imperfect, maybe historically unjust, we're generally going to respect them to avoid greater chaos.
Mhm.
Can you give us some quick examples where we've seen this norm in action, either successfully upheld or maybe unsuccessfully challenged?
Certainly. Successful aggressions altering borders after 1946 have been quite rare, as the data shows. When they have occurred, they're often linked to the unique context of decolonization, like the India-Pakistan conflict over Kashmir or North Vietnam's unification.
Special circumstances.
Kind of. And what's particularly notable is that there have been virtually no new territorial wars in Asia since 1976. That's a huge change for that region. Conversely, many aggressions have been forcefully reversed.
How so?
Regional organizations like the Organization of African Unity, now the African Union, or the Arab League, often with backing from great powers, have been remarkably effective in forcing troop withdrawals and upholding the norm. Think about Morocco being pressured to withdraw from Algeria in 1963, Somalia from Ethiopia, and Kenya in 1964.
Or Iraq from Kuwait in 1990.
Exactly. The first Gulf War is a prime example of the international community enforcing this norm. And the United Nations also consistently calls for withdrawals in such instances, reinforcing the idea that borders shouldn't be changed by force.
It really sounds like good fences make good neighbors, but on a global scale, as a way to manage conflict.
Precisely. This norm isn't really about promoting separateness or isolation. Rather, it's about establishing a global political order that deliberately tries to excise a major historical source of international violence. Mutually recognized boundaries, in this sense, become a binding force, providing a crucial framework of stability rather than being a constant source of division and war. It's a tense unit to how shared ideas, shared norms, can dramatically alter the practice of international relations.
That's a perfect segue into another profound norm that shapes our world, the nuclear taboo. This refers to the widely acknowledged public revulsion and deep inhibitions against the use of nuclear weapons.
A sense that they're just fundamentally different beyond the pale.
Exactly. It seems to have effectively delegitimized them as normal weapons of war, embedding deterrence practices within a set of stabilizing and restraining norms for state behavior. So how do we explain this incredible restraint, given that these incredibly destructive weapons exist in large numbers?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? When we try to explain why this non-use has become so ingrained, realists tend to attribute it purely to material factors.
Meaning?
They argue that nuclear weapons simply haven't been necessary for achieving military goals, or that conventional alternatives have sufficed, or purely the feel of retaliation deterrence. For them, it's about a lack of strategic utility, or the simple fear of getting blown up too.
Well, it's just rational self-interest.
Yep.
Don't use them because it's either unnecessary or too dangerous.
Exactly, a purely material calculation based on costs, benefits, and risks. But constructivists offer a much deeper, more nuanced explanation.
What do they argue?
They argue that the taboo itself, the shared revulsion, the norm fundamentally affects military capabilities and influences how choices are framed. It's not just that states choose not to use them based on calculation. The norm actually constitutes new forms of behavior and roles for actors. It becomes deeper and more widespread over time. It shapes how we think about these weapons, not just how we might use them.
That's a fascinating distinction. So it's not just a rule like don't speed, but it changes the very nature of the game, changes what the pieces mean. And this taboo didn't just appear out of nowhere, right? It had to come from somewhere.
No, not at all. It didn't just spring into existence. It was significantly driven by domestic and international grassroots peace movements, anti-nuclear activists.
People marching in the streets.
Exactly. Often despite initial resistance or skepticism from the nuclear powers themselves, like the United States. It's arguably primarily in the interest of non-nuclear states, as it offers them a form of protection against ultimate annihilation. They were often the ones campaigning most vociferously against their use and testing.
And this concept you mentioned earlier about norms having both regulative and constitutive effects seems really crucial here. Can you quickly clarify that for us again?
Certainly. A regulative norm simply constrains existing activities. Think of a speed limit. It regulates how fast you can drive, an activity that already exists, but it doesn't change what driving is. A constitutive norm, however, defines or creates entirely new forms of behavior and roles for actors. For example, the rules of chess don't just regulate how you move pieces. They constitute the game of chess itself. Without those rules, the movements are meaningless.
Got it. So how does that apply to the nuclear taboo?
For the nuclear taboo, it didn't just regulate how states used weapons. It fundamentally changed what a nuclear weapon is in the international system. It's no longer just another, more powerful bomb. It became seen as a weapon of last resort, almost beyond the pale, something fundamentally different. It constituted a new category of weapon.
That's a great distinction. So how can we see this deepening of the nuclear taboo play out historically? Can we trace its development?
Yes, absolutely. Let's look at the historical trajectory. When the U.S. used atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, no real taboo existed yet. It was a brand new weapon. The burden of proof, arguably, was on those few who doubted using it.
It was seen as a way to end the war quickly.
That was the primary justification, yes. But then, fast forward just a few years to the Korean War, from 1950 to 1953, the conversation had clearly shifted.
How so? They considered using them, didn't they?
They did consider it, but political and moral factors played a critical role in preventing their use. U.S. leaders worried deeply about public opprobrium, what the world would think about destroying Allied support, and there were genuine ethical concerns expressed about bombing cities again with such weapons. The emerging taboo, in essence, bought time and constrained a casual resort to these weapons. It wasn't fully formed, but the seeds of revulsion were definitely planted and growing.
And by the time of the Vietnam War, it seems like nuclear use was barely even discussed seriously.
Correct. There was very little serious consideration of nuclear use in Vietnam. Former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger later noted, and this is quite telling, that the moral argument against the use of such weapons took on the force of religious belief.
Wow. From strategic calculation to religious belief.
That shows how deeply the norm was embedding itself, moving from just a political calculation to a deeply held ethical imperative, at least for many decision makers and the public.
And by the Gulf War in 1991, when the U.S. was facing Iraq, it seems like the taboo was fully entrenched.
Precisely. There was hardly any serious consideration of nuclear use at all. Nuclear weapons had become firmly stigmatized as an extreme and unacceptable form of weaponry for that kind of conflict.
And interestingly, you mentioned that the availability of advanced conventional weapons was partly a result of this.
Yes, that's a fascinating feedback loop. The availability of highly accurate, powerful, conventional weapons that could achieve similar destructive effects against specific targets without the moral downside of nuclear weapons was itself, in part, a function of this nuclear stigmatization. The military developed alternatives partly because nuclear use was seen as unacceptable. The argument became, we now have conventional weapons that are almost as destructive for many targets, so why incur the massive political and moral stain of using nukes?
So, what's the ultimate takeaway here? Does the nuclear taboo powerfully demonstrate the real power of shared ideas in shaping state behavior, even on these ultimate issues of national security?
It absolutely does. The nuclear taboo is a powerful, perhaps even existential example of how shared ideas and norms can profoundly shape state behavior, pushing beyond purely material calculations and simple deterrence logic. It shows the very real power of collective belief and how it can constrain even the most powerful states from using their most destructive capabilities. It's a testament, really, to the fact that ideas, norms, shared understandings, they can truly change the world, or at least how we fight or choose not to fight in it.
Let's turn to another remarkable and perhaps slightly counterintuitive development in international relations. The vanishing declaration of war. Historically, formal declarations, I declare war on you, accompanied about half of all interstate wars. That seems pretty significant.
Yeah, it was a standard diplomatic, legal procedure.
But here's what's truly fascinating. Since 1950, while the number of wars hasn't really dropped that dramatically, only 3 were actually accompanied by formal declarations of war.
Only 3. That's tiny.
It's incredibly small.
Yeah.
And no major power, including the United States, has formally declared war since World War II. It's a striking historical shift. Why has something so historically significant virtually disappeared? It feels like something big must have changed.
That's right. And it's a crucial puzzle with a surprisingly legalistic answer. The expert insight here, from scholars like Tanisha Fazal, is that states have all but stopped issuing formal declarations of war because the rise of codified jus in bello,
Which is,
that's the body of law governing conduct during war, what we commonly call international humanitarian law, or IHL. The rise of IHL has generated significant and often unacceptable costs for those states who do formally declare war.
so it's not that war has stopped, it's that the formal declaration stopped, and it's because of the law. That seems kind of backwards.
It does seem counterintuitive, but the logic holds. Can you explain what kind of costs this compliance with IHL generates? Why would declaring war suddenly become so costly?
Certainly. Adhering to IHL, especially the modern, very detailed version, is expensive and restrictive from a purely military perspective. It requires states to eliminate specific strategies and weapons from their arsenals, things that might be militarily effective but are legally prohibited, like certain types of mines or indiscriminate bombing.
Okay, so it limits your military options.
Yes. And it also demands massive investment in military training, teaching soldiers the rules of engagement, the law of armed conflict, and employing legal advisors within the military structure, none of which directly contributes to battlefield success in a narrow sense. The U.S. military, for instance, spends, quote, at least hundreds of millions on IHL compliance and training every year.
Hundreds of millions. Okay, so compliance is expensive. And the costs of not complying, if you've declared war and are clearly bound by IHL, must be equally high or maybe higher. Indeed, violating IHL, especially in a formally declared war where its applicability is unquestioned, can lead to war crimes trials for leaders and soldiers. Think Nuremberg, The Hague. It can also lead to significant electoral punishment for politicians back home if abuses come to light.
Public backlash.
Huge public backlash. And it can severely tarnish the international reputation of the state itself, making future alliances and cooperation much harder. These are tangible, often career-ending or nation-damaging consequences.
So if compliance is costly and non-compliance is risky, what's the workaround for states? Is there a kind of no-war loophole they're exploiting?
Exactly. The no-war loophole is precisely what states often exploit. By avoiding the formal label of war, states can attempt to limit these costs. If it's not a formally declared war, the strict applicability of the full scope of IHL can sometimes be debated or argued.
Creating legal ambiguity.
Precisely. It gives them more flexibility, reduces immediate legal accountability, and allows them to engage in what they might call military operations, police actions, or interventions without triggering the full panoply of legal obligations and constraints associated with a declared war. This strategic ambiguity is a key feature of how modern conflicts are conducted.
That makes perfect sense from a state's perspective trying to manage risk. So the ramifications of declaring war extend both domestically and internationally. Can you walk us through some of those domestic legal traps first? What happens inside a country if war is declared?
Domestically, declaring war can trigger a whole cascade of specific laws and constitutional provisions that leaders might prefer to avoid. For example, the Iranian constitution stipulates election delays during wartime. India's constitution allows the federal government to basically take over state governments if war is declared.
Wow, major shifts in power.
Absolutely. And in the U.S., a formal declaration of war could, for example, automatically subject private military contractors working alongside the military to the Uniform Code of Military Justice, or UCMJ.
Which normally only applies to soldiers.
Right. This became a really thorny issue during the Iraq War regarding abuses at Abu Ghraib. Because the U.S. hadn't formally declared war, trying those contractors under UCMJ was initially complicated, highlighting a significant legal gray area created by not declaring war. These kinds of domestic legal consequences are often powerful deterrents for leaders considering a formal declaration.
Okay, so major domestic implications. And how about internationally? What kind of obligations are triggered for other states, for neutrals or allies?
On the international front, declarations of war activate specific rights and obligations for non-belligerent states, countries not involved in the fighting. Allies might be compelled by treaty to join the conflict automatically. Neutral states face strict neutrality rules, potentially having their merchant vessels seized if they don't comply with contraband lists set by the warring parties.
So it could really widen the conflict or disrupt global trade.
Definitely. It adds another layer of complexity and potential cost, as a declaration can drag other unwilling actors into the conflict or severely limit their economic activities and freedom of navigation. States often want to keep conflicts contained, and avoiding a declaration helps with that.
And the power of public opinion in media seems to play a massive role here too, doesn't it? Voters today especially with globalized media, are far more informed and potentially vocal.
Absolutely. Research, notably by scholars like Toms and Wallace, suggests that voters, particularly in democracies, increasingly care about whether their country complies with international law.
Really. More than just winning or losing.
Their studies found that public support for policies, including military action, declines significantly if those policies are seen as violating international law. Sometimes this concern for legality can even outweigh immediate material consequences or strategic benefits in the public's mind.
That's fascinating.
And with the proliferation of NGOs constantly monitoring conflicts and global media beaming images instantly around the world, it's much harder for states to hide noncompliance or abuses. This intensifies scrutiny and increases the incentive to avoid declaring war in the first place, thus avoiding the clear trigger for IHL and the precision of explicit violation.
Let's look at a couple of specific examples of this legal ambiguity in action. The 1962 Sino-Indian War is an interesting case, isn't it? India, which was a UN member, actually issued a proclamation of emergency, its constitutional equivalent of a declaration of war, while China, which wasn't in the UN at the time, did not. Why did India do that when others were already starting to avoid it?
It's a great example because it shows the context really matters. The costs of IHL compliance for India in that specific conflict were perceived as relatively low.
Why low?
Because the war was fought mainly in a sparsely populated, remote, mountainous area. So issues like protecting large civilian populations or laws regarding naval warfare or chemical weapons were less applicable or irrelevant. The main costs just weren't triggered by the nature of that specific war.
Okay, so the context minimized the downside of declaring.
Right. And India also chose not to bring the case to the United Nations, not because it feared being branded an aggressor, but apparently due to skepticism about the UN's efficacy based on past rulings on the Kashmir dispute. So, the decision to declare war or not is highly context-dependent. The perceived IHL compliance costs, alongside other strategic calculations like UN involvement, heavily influence it.
That's a crucial detail. It's not a universal rule, but a calculation in each case. And then there's the Falklands War in 1982 between the UK and Argentina. This raises an important question. Why did the British government explicitly avoid declaring war or even calling their naval exclusion zones blockades? That sounds like a very deliberate legal tightrope walk.
It absolutely was a deliberate tightrope walk. British legal advisors explicitly warned the government that using the term blockade was too closely connected historically and legally to declared or acknowledged war under international law.
And that would have triggered what?
It would have automatically triggered a whole host of specific legal obligations for the UK, particularly under things like the 1856 Declaration of Paris concerning maritime warfare, which governs things like neutral shipping rights and what constitutes an effective blockade. Britain, wanting to maintain maximum legal ambiguity and operational flexibility, justified its actions solely under UN Charter Article 51, which relates to the inherent right of self-defense.
Even if it seemed a bit strange.
Even if, as was reported, this approach caused some mirth in Parliament when a government minister had to awkwardly deny that Britain was actually at war while sending a massive task force. It was a very conscious strategy to navigate the complex legal landscape and avoid triggering those potential costly and restrictive IHL obligations associated with a formal war footing.
So what's the ultimate conclusion here? Does the very success and proliferation of international humanitarian law inadvertently lead states to avoid formal declarations, opting for this strategic use of legal ambiguity instead?
Precisely. It's one of the great paradoxes of modern international law. The increasing rigor, scope, and enforcement potential of international humanitarian law have inadvertently pushed states to sidestep its clearest trigger, the formal declaration of war. They now strategically employ legal ambiguity using terms like operation or intervention to navigate the complex moral, political, legal, and material costs that come with modern conflict. The very effort to humanize war and regulate its conduct has ironically made its formal initiation a political hot potato that most states desperately want to avoid.
That's a fascinating insight into how law shapes conflict, or maybe the avoidance of formal conflict. Now, let's shift to our final major topic, which is about the enduring value of institutions in global cooperation. In a world often characterized by that realist idea of a self-help system, where each state primarily calculates its own interests, how do these international regimes help us move beyond that? And we should clarify, regimes here means sets of practices and expectations, not just formal organizations like the UN, right?
Exactly. It's broader than just formal organizations. It includes treaties, norms, agreed upon rules, even informal understandings that shape how states interact in a particular area, like trade or environmental protection.
Okay, so how do these regimes, broadly defined, help states cooperate in that self-help world?
Well, they're absolutely crucial because they facilitate cooperation even in an anarchic world. They help governments achieve mutually beneficial agreements, even among actors who are fundamentally self-interested. They do this by tackling key problems that usually hinder cooperation.
Like what kind of problems?
First, they significantly reduce transaction costs.
We,
They lower the expense and effort involved in negotiating, coordinating policies, and making agreements among numerous states. Imagine trying to negotiate bilateral trade deals with every single country versus having a framework like the WTO. It just makes things cheaper and easier.
so they make it cheaper and easier to talk to each other, to monitor agreements, to make deals. What else?
Second, they provide vital information. They increase transparency and improve the quality and symmetry of information available to all parties. This helps combat what economists call quality uncertainty. Think of it like avoiding buying a lemon car in a used car market where the seller knows more than the buyer. Regimes help ensure everyone has more reliable data, reducing mistrust and the fear of being cheated.
Okay, lower costs, better information, anything
And
else?
third, especially for governments operating under what Herbert Simon called bounded rationality.
Meaning they can't possibly know everything or calculate perfectly?
Exactly. Decision-making is costly and complex due to limited information, time, and cognitive capacity. Regimes help by establishing rules of thumb, standard operating procedures, or norms. This allows states to save decision-making costs by often automatically obeying established regime rules rather than constantly recalculating the costs and benefits of every single interaction from scratch. They act as efficient shortcuts for effective decision-making in complex environments.
That's a great way to put it. Rules of thumb for complex decisions. And critically, you mentioned earlier that regimes facilitate not just agreements, but their decentralized enforcement. What does that mean in practice if there's no world police?
It means that they create incentives for compliance, even without a central enforcer. They primarily do this by linking issues together across time and different policy areas.
How does linking work?
Well, if a state violates its commitments on one issue within a regime, say, trade rules, it knows this can negatively impact how other states treat it on different issues in the future, maybe security cooperation or diplomatic support. It effectively turns a series of isolated choices or temptations to cheat into an iterated prisoner's dilemma, where building a reputation for long-term cooperation becomes the rational choice. Your future ability to make beneficial agreements depends on your present reliability.
So it's all about reputation then. Your credibility as a reliable partner becomes a valuable asset.
Absolutely. In this context, a state's reputation for keeping commitments becomes an incredibly crucial resource. Governments that are consistently reliable partners find it much easier to enter into advantageous international agreements in the future. Paradoxically, the realist ideal of maximizing flexibility, if it leads to unpredictability and reneging on deals, can actually be self-defeating for a state's long-term interests. No one will trust you or want to make agreements with you.
Now, let's connect this to the concept of hegemony, which we touched on earlier. Many of the contemporary international regimes we see today, like the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, which laid the groundwork for the World Trade Organization, or early post-war monetary arrangements like Bretton Woods, were largely created under conditions of overwhelming American hegemony after World War II.
That's historically accurate, yes. U.S. power was instrumental in organizing interstate relations, particularly among its allies, along lines that the U.S. preferred. This often involved what Kiem called hegemonic cooperation, a mix of paternalistic redistribution, like the Marshall Plan, combined with authoritative control and setting the rules of the game.
The ahegemon sets up the club and its rules.
Essentially, yes. However, and if we connect this to the bigger picture of cooperation persisting, even as U.S. dominance has relatively declined, cooperation does not necessarily require a hegemonic leader after regimes have been established.
So they're easier to maintain than create.
Often, yes. Regimes can take on a life of their own. They develop constituencies, establish standard practices, and generate expectations of continued cooperation. So, despite the erosion of clear U.S. dominance in many areas since the immediate post-WWII era, international cooperation has persisted, often within altered but still functioning regimes. They become frameworks for ongoing interaction, valued by the members even without the original creator pushing things along.
We can see this vividly in the fascinating case of international oil regimes, can't we? During the Suez Crisis in 1956, the U.S. exemplified that hegemonic cooperation you mentioned.
It did, perfectly. The U.S. used its vast economic and political resources and its close links with major Western oil companies to manage and resolve Europe's oil shortage caused by the canal closure. It effectively stepped in, coordinated the response, and extracted political deference from its European allies in the process. It was a clear demonstration of a hegemon using its power to manage a crisis within its sphere of influence.
But then jump forward to the 1973-74 oil crisis, triggered by the OPEC embargo. That was a very different story, wasn't it? It revealed the significance of a lack of an effective international oil regime among consuming countries.
Exactly. Faced with the embargo and soaring prices, the major oil-importing countries largely adopted narrowly self-interested approaches. They scrambled to make their own deals, engaged in panic buying, and failed to coordinate their response. This collective action failure contributed significantly to the quadrupling of oil prices.
A classic failure to cooperate.
Yes, but this stark failure, however, spurred action. It led directly to the creation of the International Energy Agency, or IEA, in 1974, specifically designed to coordinate the policies of advanced market economies regarding energy security. The IEA became a key forum for rulemaking, like establishing its emergency oil sharing system, and for crucial information provision among its members.
So a new institution was formed specifically to address that lack of cooperation and prevent a repeat. But even with the IEA in place, it still seemed to struggle with collective action problems in later crises, like during the oil price shocks following the Iranian Revolution in 1979. What does that tell us about the limits of institutions, even when they exist?
It tells us that while institutions are powerful, essential enablers of cooperation, they don't solve the underlying problems of collective action automatically. During the 1979 crisis, for example, IEA goals for demand restraint often failed because they lacked specific, binding national targets and real commitments from member states. Governments were reluctant to impose politically difficult measures at home.
So the institution was there, but the political will was weak.
Precisely. It shows the continued difficulty of cooperation even when institutions provide a framework. Hegemony might help create them, but sustained political will and commitment from the members are always needed to make them truly effective, especially when cooperation requires tangible domestic sacrifices. It's an ongoing political effort, not just a technical fix.
That makes sense. It's not a magic bullet, but a tool that requires constant maintenance and commitment from the users. Finally, let's consider the ethical dimensions of cooperation and its practical implications for foreign policy. When we look at the ethical justification for international cooperation, we can view it through at least two main lenses, what's sometimes called the morality of states view and the more cosmopolitan view. How do they differ fundamentally?
The morality of states view, often associated with realism or English school thinkers, prioritizes state sovereignty and autonomy. From this perspective, voluntary cooperation between states is easily justified as long as states are pursuing their own perceived interests and the cooperation is mutually beneficial. It respects state boundaries as morally significant.
Okay, states first. What about the cosmopolitan view?
The cosmopolitan view, drawing more from thinkers like Kant or perhaps modern philosophers like Rawls, if applied globally, denies deep moral significance to state boundaries. It focuses much more on the welfare of individuals, regardless of their nationality. It asks, does a global policy or institution benefit humanity as a whole, particularly the least advantaged individuals, irrespective of borders?
So, under that cosmopolitan view, where individual welfare is paramount, wouldn't many existing international economic regimes actually be seen as potentially morally deficient? Since, as we discussed, they often reflect the interests and power of the wealthy states that created them.
That's a very keen insight, and a common critique from a cosmopolitan perspective. Yes, under a strict cosmopolitan lens, many liberal international economic regimes might indeed be seen as morally problematic. They can disproportionately benefit advanced economies, perpetuate inequalities, and potentially hinder alternative development paths, like democratic socialism in developing nations.
So free trade might benefit the global economy overall, but hurt specific vulnerable groups.
Exactly. Or consider protectionism. While it might appeal to some workers in advanced economies who feel threatened by imports, from a cosmopolitan view, it would likely lead to overall global economic inefficiency and probably hurt more disadvantaged populations in poorer countries much more significantly. So there's a constant tension. balancing state interests, national welfare, and broader global human welfare.
But even with these potential moral deficiencies in their underlying principles, which, as you said, often reflect the interests of the powerful states that design them, are contemporary international economic regimes still, perhaps, conditionally acceptable? Is it a case of the best we can realistically do for now, preventing even worse outcomes?
That's often the pragmatic conclusion reached, even by some critics. Despite their origins and potential biases, many contemporary international economic regimes may still be considered superior to politically feasible alternatives on purely consequentialist grounds, meaning, looking at the likely outcomes, they at least mitigate some of the harsher inequities and brutalities that might exist in a world with even less cooperation, more protectionism, and more economic conflict. They're imperfect, maybe deeply so, but they often prevent worse outcomes in a world of sovereign states.
This leads to some really profound foreign policy implications, particularly perhaps a rethinking of that traditional realpolitik ideal of maximizing policy flexibility at all costs, keeping all your options open, and keeping decision-making processes closed and opaque. Historically, that secrecy and flexibility was often seen as strength. Is that still true today, given the importance of regimes and reputation?
Actually, the argument from Keohane and Nye and others is quite the opposite. That traditional approach can be quite costly in today's highly interconnected world that relies on ongoing cooperation. Governments that are too opaque, too unpredictable, that seem overly focused on short-term flexibility at the expense of commitments, they become undesirable partners in the long run.
They isolate themselves. Nobody wants to make deals with someone who might back out tomorrow.
Precisely. Intelligent, far-sighted leaders, the argument goes, understand that committing to institutions, and thus sometimes consciously limiting their immediate freedom of action, is actually essential for achieving their state's long-term objectives. It builds trust and makes future beneficial agreements possible.
So, instead of being seen as tying your own hands, making commitments is seen as building a foundation for future influence and cooperation. It's a paradox, almost.
It is a paradox, but a crucial one for navigating modern international relations. As our sources emphasize, and this is a great quote, being unpredictable not only disconcerts one's partners, but reduces one's own ability to make credible promises. In a world increasingly reliant on complex, long-term cooperation on everything from climate change to trade to security, the ability to make credible promises is a huge source of power. Sacrificing that for short-term flexibility can be deeply counterproductive. True strength now often involves the capacity for principled, reliable cooperation, even when it means foregoing some immediate, independent action. #outro.
So after all that, what does this all mean for us as we try to make sense of the world? We've journeyed through this really intricate landscape of international relations, haven't we? Uncovering how fundamental concepts like interdependence and power really shape global dynamics.
Yeah, and how those concepts themselves are debated and evolve.
We've seen how shared norms, like the territorial integrity norm respecting borders and the nuclear taboo, have dramatically altered state behavior, steering us away, thankfully, from some past patterns of rampant conflict and towards a more stable, albeit still pretty imperfect, world order.
Huge shifts compared to previous centuries.
Definitely. And we've examined the surprising, very practical, often legalistic reasons why formal declarations of war have largely vanished, replaced by this complex stance with international law and strategic ambiguity.
The persistence of international cooperation, too, even after the decline of clear American hegemonic power after World War II, truly highlights the enduring value of international institutions, those regimes we talked about.
They're not just bureaucratic structures, are they?
Not at all. They are crucial frameworks that help reduce uncertainty, they make agreements easier to reach and monitor, and they help manage the inevitable discord and friction that arises when independent states pursue their own self-interests in a shared world. They allow for a more organized, predictable global arena, even if it's often messy.
So this deep dive, I hope, reveals that the world isn't just a brutal realist competition, nor is it a utopian liberal harmony. It's a messy, fascinating blend of both, right? Where ideas, norms, and carefully constructed or sometimes strategically avoided rules play a profound role in determining how we, as a global society, navigate our shared challenges.
Understanding these forces definitely gives you a much richer perspective on the daily headlines, I think.
Yeah, it empowers you to think critically about the future of global politics, moving beyond those really simplistic good guy, bad guy narratives we often get.
So maybe to leave you, our listeners, with a provocative thought to mull over. If the ability to make credible commitments to build and maintain a reputation for reliability is becoming so crucial for states to achieve their long-term interests in this complex world,
Yeah.
does this suggest a fundamental shift in what strength truly means on the international stage?
That's a great question. I wonder if true power now is maybe less about raw coercion, less about just having the biggest military, and perhaps more about the capacity for principled, reliable cooperation. Even when, paradoxically, that means tying your own hands sometimes for the greater long-term good.
It's definitely something worth thinking about. Is the strongest state the one that can break any rule or the one that can credibly commit to uphold them?
A powerful idea to mull over as you navigate your own complex world.